Dead or alive, you're coming with me. Hey there, fellow maker. Welcome down to the shop. Bill here, and today I'm going to show you how I modified last week's pistol to look like RoboCop's Auto 9. Now this is the very same Beretta style toy that I modified last week with a few additions. You can see, of course, the firing still works. Of course, it isn't actually fully automatic like RoboCop's, but we can make pretend. I started by cooking up some reference pictures by combining my toy gun, I took a picture of it, and I laid over that actual reference images of the screen used prop. I made sure my printed images were scaled properly to my toy, and then I got to work building those additions. The first modification was to remove the sights from the toy. I sawed these off by hand and then sanded those areas flat. The rear sight was made mostly from 1/2 inch thick foam PVC plastic. I cut out the main part and sanded my edges nice and smooth. The remaining sight details were cut out using some 1/16 inch styrene plastic. Those were scored with an X-Acto knife and then snapped off. Again, those cut edges were sanded nice and smooth. The indented details on the sight were carved into the plastic using a round grinding bit in my rotary tool. This was kind of tedious, but I took my time and made sure I didn't remove too much material. All of the rear sight parts were then sanded smooth with some 220 grit sandpaper. I also rounded the edges so there would be a slight gap indent along the inner and outermost pieces along the edges where they met. Finally, I used some super glue to attach all of the sight pieces together. That finished up the rear sight, and I can move on to the rest of the gun. I did my best to match the thickness of the gun by sandwiching some of that 1/2 inch PVC foam with a couple pieces of 1/4 inch PVC foam. I guess I could have just used 2 pieces of 1/2 inch, but I don't do math very well. This sandwich piece could be cut and squared by hand with a saw, if that's all you have. I ended up taking it over to my bandsaw to cut it nice and square and 2-dimension. Next, I figured out where the barrel hole needed to go in this piece. I carefully drilled out a 1/2 inch hole in the middle of that part using a Forstner bit. A quick check confirmed that the barrel fit on nicely and in the correct place. The side details were cut from some thinner 1/8 inch PVC foam plastic. I carefully laid out all of the cuts and made them using a ruler and an X-Acto knife. To make some of the thinner parts, I used my rotary tool to modify an X-Acto blade into a thin chisel. This worked better than expected. For the rest of the cuts, I made sure to check and double check that I was removing the correct part of the cuts. When you do this kind of repetitive work, it can be easy to remove the wrong part. This was super tedious, but well worth it. The area on the gun behind this part was cut from more of that 1/16 inch styrene plastic. I cut a smaller piece for the bottom of the gun as well as a longer piece of that 1/8 inch thick PVC that would bridge the gap and hopefully connect everything together. All of these pieces got sanded to prepare them for the big glue up. But before attaching all the parts, I needed to add some more detail to the front of the gun, starting with some bevels. Now I recently found this tiny block plane, so I gave it a go, cutting away the plastic until I was pretty close to that final bevel. That little fella worked surprisingly well on the PVC foam. Of course, I went back and finished it all up using some sandpaper. Next, I used my trusty bandsaw again to cut some more details right through the front of the gun. This could be done with a scroll saw or even with a hand saw, but the bandsaw really is the best tool for this job. These details cut all the way through, so I reinserted a piece of that 1/4 inch plastic to replace the part we needed to keep. These were cut to shape and then super glued into place. Then I sanded the top nice and flush. Finally, it was time to glue everything together. First, I laminated the 2 bottom pieces together with some super glue. Then the large main part was glued down to that bottom piece. This assembly was clamped in place on the toy gun and the side panels were glued in place. Most of these parts had some extra material, so I did my best to sand it all flush. Now I didn't realize until it was too late that the sides of the gun were a little bit slanted, so these parts ended up being glued in at a slight angle. I did my best to sand it all nice and flush, but there was definitely some gaps showing. Fortunately, the side detail parts covered those gaps, and after painting they were completely obscured. At long last, it was time to glue down those side detail parts. More super glue was used, and I took my time here to make sure everything ended up lined up properly. To continue those details around the front of the gun, I used some thin strips of PVC plastic. They were glued down a bit oversized, and then I trimmed them and sanded them flush. The last bit of detail was the front sight, which was cut from a strip of that 1/4 inch PVC plastic. I laid out where I needed to drill some holes for the slots, and then I got them started with the drill press. Those slots could be cut out a number of ways. They make tiny craft knife saws that would work pretty well. I opted for my scroll saw, which made quick, clean work of the cuts. Those finished slots were then cleaned up using a needle file. Next, I cut the ends off this piece of plastic to get it to the appropriate shape. Then I super glued the sight in place on the top of the gun. One more tiny piece of 1/8 inch PVC was cut and glued in place to finish the front sight. The barrel was cut from a 1/2 inch aluminum tube and glued into place. Before gluing everything together, I roughed up the mating surfaces on the toy gun and double checked the fit. I also went over everything, including the toy gun, with some 220 grit sandpaper to get it ready for painting. When I was confident that everything was ready to go, I super glued the front gun attachment part to the toy gun. I could have probably made this part removable with just a little bit more effort, but in this case I opted to make it a permanent modification. Likewise, the rear sight was also glued in place. The paint job on this was super simple. Like last week's toy gun mod, I base coated all of this with a flat black spray paint. Unlike last week's mod, I added some metallic shine to the gun using graphite powder. I used sandpaper to grind up a graphite stick and then applied it to the gun with my fingertip. This adds a really nice but subtle metallic shine to the surface that gives it just a hint of contrast. This finish definitely needs to be sealed though. This will keep the graphite from rubbing off on your hands. I used a clear flat lacquer in my airbrush to seal it all up, protecting the finish and preserving that nice subtle shine. And that was the very last step. My RoboCop pistol was ready to hit the mean streets of old Detroit. I had an awful lot of fun using some old school techniques and building such an iconic prop from movie history. And you can see I also remember to go in and add this extended magazine later. You know what, I also got to see the actual movie prop. They've got it at the Mopop, the Science Fiction Museum in Seattle. I went there last week and grabbed some footage of it. Interesting enough, it looks like the rear sight on the real prop actually broke off. I wonder if they lost it. Anyway, this was a super fun build, pretty quick. I did it all with scrap plastic I had laying around, and you could probably knock something like this out in a weekend. I highly recommend you give a build like this a try. The results are incredibly satisfying. Hey, if you're new to prop and costume making, then, well, first of all, welcome. And second of all, you head on over to punishprops.com. We have a page just for you with a bunch of places to get started on your prop and costume making journey. We've got a bunch of links over there, tons of resources, both free and premium options for all of your learning needs. Of course, if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you catch all of our new videos. We knock these things out in a couple of weeks. And of course, if you have any questions about this build, let me know in the comments down below and I'll try and get back to you. Everything I used, all the tools and materials, you'll find those linked down in the description. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for hanging out down here in the shop with me. Happy crafting, and I'll see you in the next build. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go. Somewhere, there's a crime happening. Hey, thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you don't miss any of our new weekly prop and costume tutorial videos. For more goodies, head over to our website where you'll find blueprints, tutorial books, articles, and more. We also have a second channel for our Q&A show and extra behind the scenes videos. Thanks again and happy crafting.